The rain was relentless that night, a ceaseless rhythm tapping against the windows, dripping down the eaves, and pooling in the dark corners of the street. Most people full ocean would have stayed inside, tucked beneath their blankets, letting the storm be nothing more than a background hum. But for some, the rain seems to invite a darker presence, a subtle shift in the air that whispers of the stories best left untold. That's where our first story begins. On a night like this, in a small Scottish village called Livingstone, a place that looked innocent enough under the daylight. But when the skies opened and the storm soaked everything, became a stage for something entirely different. Several years ago, a young woman found herself in Livingston, visiting a hotel with her sister and brother-in-law. She had no plans to meet anyone that night, no reason to suspect the ordinary world would betray her. But boredom and curiosity have a way of leading even the most cautious down paths they never intended to take. She opened a few dating apps, mostly just to browse, to see who might be around. On her profile, she made it clear she wasn't meeting anyone. This was just idle conversation, an experiment in anonymity. But the universe has a peculiar sense of irony. She received a message from a man, charming and polite, claiming to be a hairdresser from Edinburgh. Their conversation started innocuously. Friendly banter, light jokes exchanged over the distance of the app. By the next morning, the message shifted in tone. Subtly at first, then more aggressive, hinting at desires she had explicitly said she was not interested in. He escalated quickly, abusive words replacing charm, and she felt the chill of fear creep in, the kind that makes your skin prick under the hair on your neck. What she didn't know at the time was that this man was far more dangerous than she could have imagined. Years later, he would be exposed as someone who had deliberately targeted women through the very app she had used that night, using deception to lure victims and inflict harm. She had unknowingly avoided becoming another statistic by the smallest decision, a decision as simple as refusing to meet him. That night, as the rain poured outside, she learned an unsettling truth. Sometimes, danger isn't in the shadows outside your window, but in the messages that seem harmless at first. Contrast frames the next tale. Imagine a place far from the deceptive charm of human malice. A hospital, old and labyrinthine, with its original stone building creaking under decades of use. Our storyteller worked there for 7 years, familiar with every nook and sterile corner. The hospital had seen illness, recovery, and death. Yet it still held secrets the staff didn't always recognize. One evening, in that old, half-forgotten part of the building, the elevators, sandwiched between the newer wings and the original structure, became a stage for something unexplainable. He stepped into the elevator, pressing the button to go up a few floors. Nothing seemed unusual at first, until the elevator began descending, taking him to the basement level instead of the floor he intended. He assumed someone had called it before him, a reasonable thought in any busy hospital. But when the doors opened, he realized something was off. The basement was empty, silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. No one had called the elevator, and yet there it sat, doors open, refusing to respond to any buttons he pressed. Minutes passed. He tried every button, every combination, yet the elevator refused to move. Then, as if on cue, the door shut the instant he stepped out. The elevator obeyed commands again, but the message was clear. Something wanted him in the basement that night, and it had a will of its own. There was no logical explanation, no mechanical failure to account for the feeling of being watched, of the building itself bending reality to draw him down. It was a silent insistence, the kind of force you can't argue with, the type that leaves a lingering question in your mind long after you've left the scene. From haunted elevators, we move to the darkness beneath a family home, where decades of secrets are buried in stone and shadow. In 1965, a man purchased a house that seemed too good to be true, a bargain that raised eyebrows even as he signed the papers. Built in the 1920s, the house was large, beautiful, and most importantly, had a basement that flooded with rainwater every winter. That basement would become the focal point of years of strange experiences, including visits from agents who claimed to be from the FBI, all asking questions about events that had occurred long before the family moved in. It seemed that someone had died in that basement years earlier, a woman whose fate remained unclear, though her presence lingered in the shadows of the house. Over time, the family experienced something more personal, more immediate. Shadowy figures appearing in dreams, hovering over a sleeping mother until the father intervened. Doors needed to be locked, keys removed. A precise ritual just to prevent the presence from intruding. The house, with all its charm and historical beauty, had become a nexus of tension between the ordinary and the supernatural. Each decision, each door left unlocked or key left in place, became a potential invitation for the darkness to enter. These stories, varied as they are, share a common thread. Ordinary moments turning extraordinary. Mundane locations shifting into spaces of unease. Livingstone, the hospital, the house. They are reminders that terror often hides in plain sight, waiting for subtle changes in circumstance. A storm, an elevator's descent, a basement door left unlocked. And when you listen closely, when you hear the rain tapping against your window tonight, perhaps you can sense it too. The quiet insistence of the world reminding you that danger can appear anywhere, in anyone, and at any time. Even as we move from one setting to the next, the rain binds them together, a constant reminder that the world is not as safe as it seems. Each drip mirrors a heartbeat, a soft warning to pay attention, to notice the details others might dismiss. Because in the details the horror hides. Not always obvious, not always immediate, but persistent. And as we follow these stories further into the night, remember, you are not just hearing tales, you are stepping into them, walking alongside the characters, feeling what they felt, questioning what is real. By now, the rain is no longer background noise. It is a participant in these stories, a living element in a world that is slightly off-kilter, where normality can bend under the weight of unseen forces. Each puddle on the pavement, each flicker of lightning, and each rumble of thunder echoes the tension that these tales carry. An anticipation that grows steadily with every detail revealed, every choice made, every moment of fear held in suspended disbelief. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the shadows it left behind were thicker than ever, creeping along streets, slipping into alleys, curling around corners of houses that seemed perfectly normal by day. In one quiet neighborhood, a man recalled the strange occurrences in the house he had grown up in, a place that should have been safe, but wasn't. The family had long since learned that the house had rules no one had written. Doors had to be locked, keys removed, windows closed. All small rituals that kept the presence at bay. Breaking these rules even once invited the darkness in, a shadowy figure that moved with patience and persistence, silent but impossible to ignore. His mother had been the first to notice it. In her dreams, she would feel the presence standing over her, watching, observing, until the father woke and the figure vanished. These dreams were not fleeting. They were exhausting, draining, leaving an imprint on reality that persisted long after she woke. The father experimented with locking doors, observing how the shadow reacted, documenting with meticulous care the parameters that would keep the household safe. Yet even with all the precautions, the unease never fully left. Family gatherings, holidays, even ordinary weekday nights were colored by a quiet tension, an unspoken acknowledgement that the house had its own agenda. Contrast this with another story, this one set far away from the domestic confines of a haunted house, in the heart of a bustling hospital, where life and death intersect in sterile hallways and under the bright glare of fluorescent lights. The supernatural made its presence felt in unexpected ways. The elevators, usually predictable and unremarkable, began to behave differently. Staff reported feeling watched, hearing whispers in empty corridors, and stepping into elevators that defied logic. The descent into the basement that one night was not an isolated incident. Others had felt the same inexplicable tug, an insistence that they enter spaces they would rather avoid. The basement itself became a character in its own right, a dark liminal space where the boundaries between reality and something else were blurred. Old hospital buildings often carry echoes of the past, remnants of lives lived and lost within their walls. But this basement was different. It was as if the building itself had memory, an awareness of who entered and why. Staff members spoke of the feeling of being followed, of shadows lingering just out of sight, and of cold drafts that moved against the natural flow of air. And yet, no camera ever captured anything tangible. No mechanical failure could explain the elevator's erratic behavior. Logic fell short in a place that seemed to be operating under rules unknown. From hospitals to urban streets, the rain continued to be a silent witness. It seeped into the cracks of the city, slipping beneath doors, soaking clothes, and washing the world in a muted, grey sheen. In one story, a woman's night was interrupted not by shadows or ghosts, but by human malice disguised as charm. A man she had met online, whose messages began with polite conversation, escalated into threats and harassment. Her refusal to meet him, an ordinary decision on any other night, became a matter of life and death. Years later, the man's true intentions were revealed. A reminder that terror does not always come cloaked in darkness or supernatural form. It can arrive wrapped in the familiar, in text messages, in someone smiling across a coffee table. Contrast adds tension to our understanding of fear. The supernatural, the shadowy, the inexplicable sits on one side of the spectrum. On the other, human cruelty is no less terrifying because it is deliberate, planned, and tangible. The woman in Scotland made a choice, and that choice saved her from a fate she could scarcely imagine at the time. But the stories of the hospital elevator and the haunted house were different. They spoke of forces beyond human comprehension, forces that did not negotiate, that did not explain themselves, that demanded attention through persistence rather than argument. Consider the power of place in these stories. In the Scottish village, the setting was ordinary. Small streets, local hotels, quiet corners. But the danger came from a human element, something entirely believable, yet horrifying in hindsight. In the hospital, the setting was structured, clinical, predictable. Yet the environment itself became unpredictable, as if it had an agenda. In the house with the shadowy presence, the setting was intimate, personal. Every hallway and locked door a threshold between safety and threat. Place is crucial because it shapes fear. The more normal and familiar it appears, the more effective the horror becomes, embedding itself into memory and imagination. The rain plays another role here, more subtle but no less important. It muffles sound, isolates people, and creates an atmosphere of heightened awareness. In darkness, the world shrinks, the mind stretches to fill the void, filling gaps in perception with possibilities that are terrifying precisely because they cannot be proven. One might hear a creak in the floorboards, the soft hum of an elevator motor, or the click of a lock in the hallway, and interpret it through the lens of fear. The rain, then, is not just a backdrop. It is a co-conspirator, amplifying tension, encouraging imagination, to wander to places it might not go on a clear night. Our next story takes us to a place even more isolated, a forest road in the middle of a relentless storm. A man driving home late one night found himself caught in the downpour. Visibility reduced to a few feet ahead. The tires cut through shallow puddles, creating rhythmic splashes that mirrored the sound of his racing heartbeat. Somewhere in the darkness, something moved. At first, he assumed it was wildlife. A deer, perhaps, startled by the weather. But as the shadows shifted and the sound of footsteps, or was it scraping, followed his vehicle, the rational explanations began to fail. He realized he was being watched, not by eyes, but by a presence that understood the road, the storm, and his own fear. There is a pattern emerging if one looks closely. Fear thrives in liminality, in moments between certainty and ambiguity, between action and inaction, between safety and exposure. The woman in Scotland avoided human danger by choosing not to meet a stranger. The hospital staff experienced inexplicable mechanical behavior that defied logic. The family at home learned that shadows could only be kept at bay through ritual and precision. And the man on the forest road discovered that isolation amplifies every sound, every movement, every heartbeat into something that could be mortal. These stories are united by the rain, which binds them together in more than just mood. It is a physical and psychological filter, shaping how the events unfold, muting some details while amplifying others. It adds weight to footsteps, exaggerates the hiss of a vent, and makes the smallest sound, a whisper, a knock, a breath, feel monumental. The rain is a companion to our terror, a consistent, unyielding witness that reminds us of vulnerability, reminding us that even in the most mundane surroundings, fear can thrive. By the time the rain has soaked through to your bones, you begin to notice a rhythm, a cadence that mimics the stories themselves. A rise in tension, a pause for breath, a sudden revelation, and then a slow creeping unease. Whether in a city apartment, a hospital basement, a Scottish hotel, or a remote road in the forest, the mechanics of fear are the same. The ordinary is disrupted, and in that disruption, the imagination flourishes, and so we continue, moving deeper into the storm, where the next stories will challenge what you believe about safety, reality, and the line between life and something else entirely. The storm had intensified, drumming against rooftops with a persistence that made the world feel smaller, as if the rain were pressing in from every direction. On a deserted country road, a young couple drove cautiously, their headlights barely cutting through the curtain of water. It was late, and they were eager to reach the safety of their cabin tucked deep in the woods. Yet, with each mile, the feeling of being watched grew, subtle at first, a shadow darting between trees, a flash of movement that vanished when they blinked. They dismissed it initially, blaming fatigue or the tricks of light on wet asphalt. But soon, the trees themselves seemed alive, bending in unnatural ways, groaning as though whispering secrets in the storm. The couple argued quietly, each rationalizing away the strange sensations, until the road forked unexpectedly. One path appeared normal, familiar even, but the other led down a narrow, mud-slicked trail that no map had ever indicated. Against their better judgment, curiosity, or perhaps a compulsion they did not understand, drove them down the hidden path. Contrast this with the urban terror that strikes quietly in plain sight. In a seemingly safe apartment complex, a resident noticed small changes that at first seemed trivial. Items slightly moved, doors left ajar, sounds in the walls that had no identifiable source. The mind initially seeks explanations, drafts, mechanical creaks, forgetfulness. But when those small disturbances accumulate, they evolve into a narrative that cannot be ignored. Fear here is psychological, a slow-building tension that crawls along the edges of consciousness. Unlike a sudden storm or an overt threat, it thrives in ambiguity, in the spaces where logic hesitates and imagination takes over. In the cabin, the couple experienced both the physical and psychological dimensions of fear. As they entered, the smell of damp wood and earth filled the air, mixing with an unsettling cold that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The storm outside was relentless, yet inside, the house had its own peculiar rhythm. Floors creaked as though someone invisible moved between rooms. A faint knocking echoed from the attic, and the shadows cast by candlelight shifted unnaturally. Each sound amplified their unease. Each flicker of light suggested a presence that was not theirs. The contrast between these scenarios, the urban and the rural, the familiar and the isolated, demonstrates a fundamental truth about horror. Context shapes terror. In a city apartment, fear is often subtle, creeping. A psychological game where rationality clashes with instinct. In isolation, like the storm-bound cabin, fear is immediate and visceral, amplified by environmental factors, sensory deprivation, and the lack of escape. Yet both forms are effective because they exploit human vulnerability, the need for control, the expectation of safety, and the instinct to predict what comes next. Consider another account, one that occurred in a quiet seaside town during a relentless downpour. A man walking home noticed the usual comfort of the rain turning into something oppressive, almost sentient. Each step along the slick pavement was accompanied by the sound of a second, lighter step that mirrored his own. When he turned to look, no one was there. He quickened his pace, and the echo followed, always a heartbeat behind. By the time he reached his front door, the sense of being pursued had settled deep into his nerves, leaving a lingering dread that did not dissipate when he stepped inside. The story parallels another, in which an individual exploring an abandoned factory stumbled upon machinery that seemed to operate without power. Conveyor belts creaked, gears turned with no visible mechanism, and the hum of electricity, or something like it, pervaded the air. The place was supposed to be empty, yet each movement suggested intention, intelligence. Unlike the seaside man, who was preyed upon by his imagination and a rhythm that mimicked his own, the factory explorer confronted a tangible environment seemingly imbued with awareness, capable of responding to human presence in unpredictable ways. The theme of choice is also central to these narratives. In some cases, like the woman in Scotland, decisions, however mundane they seemed at the time, altered outcomes dramatically. Refusing to meet a stranger spared her from a hidden danger that only became apparent years later. In other cases, like the couple in the cabin or the man on the seaside street, choices intensified their encounters with fear. Taking the hidden trail or ignoring the echoing step invited terror closer, testing courage, curiosity, and survival instincts. These contrasts illuminate a key element of storytelling. Suspense is heightened when the audience sees the consequences of decisions, or when they imagine themselves in the same position. The rain continues to act as both a literal and symbolic backdrop. In the countryside, it isolates, masking sounds, obscuring vision, and creating a sensory tunnel that heightens every small movement into a threat. In urban settings, it can blur lights, distort sounds, and create illusions in reflective surfaces, turning familiar streets into unfamiliar landscapes. The audience is drawn into these environments, understanding the vulnerability of the characters and, in turn, experiencing a vicarious fear that is as much about anticipation as it is about immediate danger. One particularly harrowing story involves a man exploring an abandoned hotel during a storm. The building, left to decay over decades, had a certain grandeur that clashed with the pervasive decay. As he moved through the grand hallways, he noticed that some rooms were unnaturally cold, with shadows that moved independently of the dim, flickering lights. In one corridor, a door that had been closed shut silently, though no one had touched it. He felt compelled to investigate, and upon opening it, discovered a room filled with objects that seemed out of place. Old photographs, trinkets, personal effects that suggested the presence of someone or something still inhabiting the space. Contrast is again evident here. The Grand Hotel, once a place of light, life, and luxury, had transformed into a stage for isolation and uncertainty. The juxtaposition of the familiar and the uncanny amplifies terror. The man knew what a hotel should be, what it should feel like, yet every step contradicted that knowledge. This technique of subverting expectation is central to effective storytelling, keeping the audience engaged, on edge, and perpetually questioning what is real versus imagined. The psychological dimension is reinforced by environmental cues. In all these tales, rain, shadow, isolation, and unexpected movement serve as amplifiers, creating patterns the mind interprets as intentional. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and the presence of anomaly triggers fear because it signals unpredictability, potential danger, and the unknown. Whether it is a shadow hovering over a bed, an elevator that defies logic, footsteps echoing in the rain, or a door that locks itself, the effect is the same. The ordinary becomes extraordinary, and the familiar becomes threatening. The next story shifts focus to a more intimate terror, one experienced at home in what should be a sanctuary. A single parent, alone during a stormy night, noticed the sounds of whispering emanating from the walls. At first, it was subtle, barely audible, almost comforting in its cadence. But over hours, the whispers became coherent, repeating phrases that seemed to anticipate her thoughts. Objects moved slightly, chairs shifted, and shadows stretched unnaturally across walls and ceilings. She attempted to rationalize, attributing the phenomena to the storm, the wind, or her own fatigue. Yet the sense of being observed and engaged persisted, forcing her to confront a reality where the house itself seemed aware, sentient, and possibly hostile. The storm outside raged with relentless intensity, and the small apartment seemed alive with a subtle malevolence. The parent, now fully alert, moved from room to room, checking windows and doors, trying to convince herself that everything was normal. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent, echoing in the corners and amplifying with each footstep. When she reached the kitchen, she noticed that items had shifted inexplicably. Cups, utensils, even a small vase that had been on the counter now lay on the floor, intact but out of place. It was impossible for anyone else to have entered, yet she felt an undeniable presence. Contrast this with fear that builds gradually in public spaces, where isolation is temporary, but the mind still senses danger. Consider the man walking home in the rain, footsteps following his own, invisible but undeniably there. In this situation, fear is sustained by anticipation. The uncertainty of who or what might emerge from shadows or slip from the periphery. In the apartment, fear is intimate, almost tactile, a constant companion that invades personal space. The difference highlights how environment, expectation, and proximity shape the psychological impact of horror. The parent tried various methods to reclaim control. She turned on all the lights, unplugged appliances, and even called a friend to reassure herself that she was not imagining things. But the whispers adapted, seemingly responding to the intrusion, changing tone and rhythm, as if mocking her attempts at logic. She retreated to the bedroom, locking the door. Yet even there, the phenomenon persisted. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, the air felt heavier. and a cold draft brushed her skin despite all windows being closed. Each action she took to create safety seemed to intensify the disturbances, as if the apartment itself resisted her authority. In a nearby city, another story unfolded under similar circumstances. A security guard working the night shift in an abandoned office tower noticed lights flickering erratically. Hallways stretched farther than they should have. Doors appeared where none existed, and faint noises, footsteps, whispers, objects shifting, echoed from floors above. Yet no one else was present. Rational explanation failed. Electrical systems were checked. Cameras showed empty halls. Yet the sense of being watched and manipulated grew stronger with every hour. Just like the parent in the apartment, the guard faced a space that seemed alive, aware, and increasingly hostile. Both scenarios employ a storytelling technique central to effective horror: the slow escalation of tension. Initially, disturbances are minor, almost ignorable. A shadow, a sound, a shifted object. These can be dismissed, rationalized, or forgotten. But as the story unfolds, the frequency, intensity, and personalization of the events grow. The audience experiences this escalation vicariously, feeling the creeping dread alongside the protagonist. It is the anticipation, the unseen threat, that creates the deepest terror, not the immediate visual horror. Returning to the apartment, the parent eventually decided to confront the unknown directly. She spoke aloud, questioning the presence, demanding it reveal itself, attempting to assert dominance over a force she could neither see nor understand. For hours, the whispers responded, first with incoherent murmurs, then with phrases that mirrored her own thoughts, fears, and regrets. It became clear that the entity, or whatever it was, had intimate knowledge of her life, exploiting vulnerabilities and insecurities. The psychological impact was profound. Fear intertwined with the uncanny sensation that her most private moments were now public, observed, and manipulated. Contrast this with more external horrors, such as being lost in a rain-soaked forest or isolated on a stormy road. In those scenarios, fear arises primarily from external threats: animals, strangers, supernatural phenomena, where the environment itself is adversarial. In the apartment, the environment is internalized, familiar as safe, and supposed to be safe. Yet it turns hostile. This reversal of expectation, safe spaces becoming threatening, intensifies terror because it violates one of the most basic assumptions humans hold: that home, shelter, and personal space are sanctuaries. Another compelling story involves a man exploring an abandoned hospital during a storm. Unlike the apartment or urban street, this setting combined both external and internal threats. The hospital's old, creaking floors and echoing hallways amplified every sound, creating a disorienting echo chamber. An elevator that refused to obey logic, doors opening to empty spaces, and a pervasive chill made the environment itself a character, actively interacting with the man's presence. Each anomaly forced him to question perception and reality. In contrast to the urban or domestic horrors, this narrative relies heavily on environmental unpredictability, demonstrating how space and architecture can serve as tools for psychological manipulation. In both the apartment and hospital, fear is deeply tied to the notion of choice, or lack thereof. The parent could not leave without abandoning their home and privacy. The explorer could not turn back without risking disorientation or further exposure to danger. Each decision carried consequences, real or perceived, heightening tension and engagement. Effective horror storytelling often relies on presenting characters with decisions that feel consequential, as this mirrors the audience's own instinctive calculations of risk and safety. Another element these stories share is the ambiguity of the threat. In the apartment, it was never fully revealed what the whispers were, or if the shadows had intentionality. In the hospital, the elevator's behavior and strange environmental cues suggested intelligence. But whether this was supernatural, mechanical, or psychological remained unclear. Ambiguity forces the audience to fill gaps with imagination, often generating fears more intense than any explicit revelation could. Humans instinctively imagine the worst-case scenario, and horror writers exploit this tendency, leaving crucial questions unanswered to maintain suspense and engagement. The role of rain, in particular, is significant in these narratives. It isolates, muffles familiar sounds, and creates a natural rhythm that can amplify tension. The constant, unyielding patter of raindrops provides a backdrop for suspense, masking subtle auditory cues while emphasizing others. In both urban and rural settings, rain acts as a force that transforms space. Streets shimmer deceptively, forests take on fluid forms, buildings appear larger or more menacing under wet surfaces. It is both a literal and symbolic device, reinforcing themes of isolation, unpredictability, and discomfort. Consider a final story in this section. A woman driving home through a storm noticed her GPS suddenly malfunctioning. Roads appeared where none existed. Turns were rerouted inexplicably, and familiar landmarks twisted into unrecognizable forms. Panic grew as the world seemed to reshape around her, a labyrinth designed to trap rather than guide. Eventually, she arrived at her destination, but the experience left a lasting impression, a sense of dislocation and distrust toward environments once taken for granted. This mirrors the apartment and hospital stories. Spaces meant to provide orientation and security instead became unpredictable, hostile, and psychologically taxing. Through all these examples, a pattern emerges. The most compelling horror stories exploit contrast, subvert expectations, and manipulate environment, sensory input, and personal vulnerability. The audience is drawn into situations where ordinary spaces or actions are rendered unfamiliar, where familiar rules do not apply, and where anticipation and imagination drive terror more than any overtly gruesome act. The interplay between known and unknown, internal and external threats, choice and inevitability forms the backbone of effective storytelling. As the storm finally eased, a sense of lingering unease remained. The parent returned to their usual routine, yet the whispers and shadows had left invisible marks, subtle reminders that the boundary between the ordinary and the uncanny is fragile. The explorer left the hospital, but every creak of a floorboard, every flicker of light in other buildings triggered memories of that unsettling night. The driver who had navigated the twisted streets could no longer trust the familiar layout of her neighborhood, her mind constantly anticipating anomalies that might never appear. These stories share a truth. Horror thrives not in gore or spectacle, but in the tension between what is expected and what is possible. It is the manipulation of space, perception, and the mind's own anticipatory fear that lodges most deeply in memory. In the rain, shadows stretch longer, sounds echo differently, and familiar places transform into uncanny landscapes, reminding us that sometimes the most terrifying experiences are those closest to home, unseen and almost plausible.